Imagine you are a German soldier in the freezing winter of 1942. You are stationed on the brutal Eastern Front, exhausted, huddled in a trench, trying to survive the biting cold. The night is pitch black. The radar shows absolutely nothing. The sky above you is completely silent. But then, you hear it. A quiet, terrifying, whooshing sound echoing from the clouds above. It sounds exactly like a massive, sweeping broomstick. Before you can even shout to wake up your unit, the dark sky violently erupts into flames. Your ammunition depot is blown to pieces, and your entire camp is thrown into absolute chaos. By the time you realize what hit you, the attackers are already gone, vanished back into the dark. You have just survived an encounter with the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. But what terrified the German army the most wasn't the bombs. It was the fact that this terrifying elite squad of nighttime assassins was made up entirely of women, most of them college students, factory workers, and teenagers under the age of 22. The Nazis were so utterly traumatized by the psychological warfare they inflicted, they gave them a nickname that went down in military history: the Night Witches. But the most insane part of their story isn't just what they did to the Nazis. It is the fact that their own military set them up to completely fail. To understand how the Night Witches came to exist, you have to understand the absolute desperation of the Soviet Union in 1941. Hitler had just launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers, backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft, poured into the Soviet Union. The Soviet Red Army was being absolutely decimated. Millions of soldiers were killed or captured in the first few months alone. Major cities were reduced to rubble. The country was on the brink of total collapse. As the men were slaughtered on the front lines, Soviet women desperately wanted to fight. They didn't just want to be nurses or factory workers. They wanted to shoot, and they wanted to fly. But the male commanders of the Red Army flatly refused. Women in combat were viewed as a liability. It took the sheer willpower of one woman to change the course of the war. Her name was Marina Raskova. She was the Amelia Earhart of the Soviet Union, a legendary record-breaking aviator who was personally respected by Joseph Stalin. As the Soviet death toll reached catastrophic numbers, Raskova used her political influence to corner Stalin. She convinced him that ignoring half of his population while the country was burning was military suicide. Finally, out of absolute desperation, Stalin signed an order allowing Raskova to form 3 entirely female air squads. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of young women from across the country flooded the recruiting stations. Raskova selected the best of them and brought them to a tiny aviation school near the Volga River. They were told to cut off their braids, strip off their civilian clothes, and prepare for a brutal, condensed training program. What usually took male pilots 3 years to learn, these women were forced to master in just 6 months. They trained 14 hours a day. They learned to be pilots, navigators, mechanics, and armorers. But despite their incredible dedication, the male commanders of the military still treated them like a complete joke. The disrespect they faced was staggering. First, they were denied properly fitting gear. The military simply handed them leftover, hand-me-down male uniforms. The jackets dragged on the ground. The pants had to be tied with rope, and the boots were so massive that the women had to rip up their own bed sheets and stuff the cloth into the toes, just so their shoes wouldn't fall off when they walked. But the ultimate insult was the aircraft they were given. While male pilots were handed heavy, armored fighter jets, the women of the 588th Regiment were given the Polikarpov Po-2. This was a 1920s crop-dusting biplane, originally designed for training and spraying chemicals on farms. It was made entirely out of thin plywood and canvas fabric stretched over a wooden frame. It had zero armor. It had no radio. It had no radar. The cockpits were completely open to the elements, meaning the women were entirely exposed to sub-zero winter temperatures, driving rain and blinding snow at 10,000 feet in the air. The planes were so incredibly slow that they had a top speed of only 90 miles per hour. For context, the German Messerschmitt fighter planes they were flying against could reach speeds of nearly 400 miles per hour. A German pilot could literally fly circles around them. If a single tracer bullet from an enemy gun hit the canvas wing of the women's planes, the entire aircraft would burst into flames like a piece of dry paper. And to make this suicide mission even more horrifying, the military commanders refused to give the women parachutes until 1944. If your wooden plane caught fire, you burned alive, or you jumped. Because their planes were practically flying death traps, the women knew they could never survive daytime combat. A German fighter jet would shred them in seconds. So, they invented a tactical maneuver that was so incredibly dangerous, so utterly insane, that it completely changed the dynamic of the war. They decided they would only fly in the absolute dead of night. Navigation was a nightmare. Remember, they had no radios and no radar. They flew in the pitch black using only a paper map, a compass, and a stopwatch. The navigator would sit in the back seat, furiously calculating wind speed and time to figure out exactly where they were in the dark. When they reached their target, usually a German supply depot, a train yard, or a troop encampment, they would execute their signature, terrifying tactic. They flew in groups of 3. The first 2 planes would fly directly over the German base, deliberately making themselves visible, to draw heavy anti-aircraft fire and the blinding glare of massive searchlights. It was a deadly game of distraction. While the Germans were frantically shooting at the first 2 planes, the third plane would sneak up from behind. But a wooden crop duster has a very loud, sputtering engine that would easily give away their position. To truly sneak up on the enemy, the female pilot would wait until she was perfectly aligned with the target. Then, thousands of feet in the air, she would reach down and physically turn her plane's engine completely off. The heavy wooden plane would suddenly drop into a silent glide, with no engine noise to warn the soldiers below. The only sound was the wind rushing over the canvas wings and the wooden struts. It sounded exactly like a witch's broomstick sweeping through the air. They would glide in absolute silence through the pitch black, drop their bombs with terrifying precision, restart their engines mid-air just before hitting the ground, and vanish back into the night. They did this over and over and over again. Because their wooden planes were so small and frail, they could only carry 2 lightweight bombs at a time. This meant that to do any serious military damage, these women had to fly back to base, reload in the dark, and fly back out into the freezing, deadly sky, over and over again. It was common for a single crew to fly up to 18 separate bombing missions in a single night. The physical toll was unimaginable. Between missions, the female mechanics worked frantically in the dark, patching bullet holes in the canvas wings with glue and cloth and manually loading heavy bombs onto the wings by hand. The pilots were so exhausted that they would fall asleep in their open cockpits while waiting for their planes to be rearmed, only to wake up 5 minutes later and fly back into enemy fire. Frostbite was rampant. Some navigators had to take their gloves off in the freezing open air just to properly mark their paper maps, causing their skin to literally peel off onto their pencils. But their relentless, exhausting schedule worked. The psychological terror they inflicted on the Nazis was unprecedented. German soldiers were terrified to sleep. Commanders actually spread rumors that the Soviet government was feeding the women special experimental medical pills that gave them the night vision of cats. The German military put a massive automatic bounty on their heads. Any Nazi pilot who managed to shoot down a night witch would instantly be awarded the prestigious Iron Cross medal. But they couldn't catch them. Ironically, the very thing that made the wooden biplanes so terrible is what saved them, because the crop dusters flew so incredibly slow, the high-speed German fighter jets couldn't properly target them. The stall speed of a German jet, the speed at which it would lose lift and fall out of the sky, was actually faster than the top speed of the wooden planes. If a German jet slowed down enough to get behind a night witch to shoot her, the jet's engine would stall, and the Nazi pilot would plummet toward the earth. One of the most legendary pilots of the regiment, Nadezhda Popova, perfectly summarized their sheer badassery. During one terrifying mission, she and her navigator were caught in a web of German searchlights. Anti-aircraft fire ripped through her canvas plane. When she finally managed to land back at her base, completely exhausted, her mechanic counted 42 individual bullet holes in her small wooden plane. The map resting on her lap had been shot straight through. Popova simply patched the plane, reloaded the bombs, and flew out again the next night. By the end of the war in 1945, these brilliant, fearless women had flown over 30,000 successful combat missions. They dropped more than 23,000 tons of explosives on the Nazi army. They forced entire German battalions to retreat and destroyed vital supply chains. That helped turn the tide of the entire war. They paid a heavy price. 32 members of the regiment died in combat, many of them burning alive in the sky because they were denied parachutes. But their heroism could not be ignored by the commanders who had once mocked them. 23 of these pilots and navigators were awarded the highest honor in the country, the Hero of the Soviet Union. They were given the worst equipment in the entire military. They were told they were a liability. They were handed oversized boots and wooden death traps. They were the night witches.